Thanks very much. Kristen, you can hear me all right? Excellent. It's always worth checking. Yeah, I've been given a pretty challenging task here. And when our smaller group has met a couple of times since the last workshop that we had the broader group in, yeah, I think we all agree that we're starting to realize just how challenging this task is. But why, I just want to unpack a bit. First of all, why is it so challenging? And if I can start with Target 2 itself, which Kristen mentioned, Target 2 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and I've got up there the wording that they finally ended up agreeing on in Montreal. And I just want to highlight a couple of components of this to really put the challenge that we're facing within a context. And first of all, the part of this target that is about restoring 30% of areas of degraded ecosystems. And that, at first, that sounds fine, a very simple target, but the more you look at that and think about it, the more you realize that can be interpreted in just so many different ways. And I've just included a few examples there of quite plausible interpretations for a hypothetical ecosystem type. So say if you've got an ecosystem type that originally covered 100,000 hectares, there's the remaining area of 20,000 hectares. So quite a lot of that ecosystem has been lost. And then of the remaining area, I'll just move, I can't actually see my slide here, that's a bit better. Of the remaining area, about 15,000 hectares is still relatively intact. So it means there's about 5,000 hectares that's considered in a degraded state. So just with those simple numbers, three quite plausible interpretations of Target 2 for that ecosystem type could mean 30% of the original area of the ecosystem. That would mean 30,000 hectares as a restoration target, or it could be 30% of the remaining area of the ecosystem, which would only mean 6,000 hectares. I think I've got that right. Oh no, I might have got that wrong. Anyway, something like that. And then thirdly, another possibility is 30% of the degraded portion of the remaining area, which would only be 1,500 hectares. So I just put that up there just to demonstrate that, for this target, like a lot of the other targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework, they're still left open to interpretation. The other problem or challenge here is in relation to the second part of the target, which is basically saying that as well as getting 30% restoration, that has to be done in a way that enhances biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, ecological integrity and connectivity. So as soon as you see something like that, it becomes pretty clear that to achieve that is going to be a function not just of the total area restored, but also of the effectiveness of that restoration in any given location, and also of the spatial configuration of restoration actions. For example, the extent to which that enhances connectivity, or whether the restoration is located in the right places in terms of the species that need to benefit from it, and so on. So I think these sorts of things become particularly problematic and challenging when we start thinking about how we go from a big global target like Target 2 and bring that right down to how to prioritize and implement restoration actions on ground at a more of a landscape or local scale. So what I'm going to do now is just outline a bit of a conceptual framework that I've found useful at least for me, in thinking about the relationship between goals, targets, and indicators. And it differs a little bit from how others think about the relationship between these. So, those on the call may or may not find this useful, but it's just something I've found particularly useful. And I'm thinking here of the challenge, as I said before, of translating those big global targets, in this case, target 2, the restoration target, translating that and downscaling that to something that can really help inform and report on actions on the ground at a much more of a landscape or local scale. And sorry to use the word landscape. I know we're not just focused on terrestrial, but just quickly to just outline the way I think about this, and I think Kristen and others will be talking about the selection of priority assets later, essentially, identifying priority ecosystem types that require or deserve restoration attention within Australia. But let's just assume that we're focusing on one of those assets, say a priority ecosystem type. Then the way I think about goals, indicators, and targets is as follows. I like to think of a goal as being the direction that we want to move the asset in this case through restoration action. So that's really defining the direction that we want to move the system. I think of an indicator as a measure of the distance moved in that desired direction. And then I think of a target as the distance that we aim to move according to that indicator, how far we want to move by a given point in time, for example, by 2030. And so this differs a little bit from the order in which people often think of defining these things. Often people want to start with goals, then define targets, and then only once they've defined targets do they then start talking about the need for indicators. And I don't want to bog the discussion down now, but I feel very strongly that a much more effective way of working is in fact to define indicators first, and only then, when you've got that agreement on how you're actually going to measure progress, do you then set a target in relation to that measure. But we can always debate that a bit later if there's time. And then just to complete the picture, if we have those three things, the goal or goals, indicators, and targets, then we're in a position to start doing things like monitoring and reporting on progress towards the target, and doing that in terms of the indicator or set of indicators that have been specified. It also puts us in a position to, using exactly the same indicator or indicators, so the same measurement scale, to then start looking at prioritizing further actions. So in other words, how much further improvement would you get in moving the value of that indicator towards the target by implementing different types of actions within that ecosystem, or actions in different places within the ecosystem. So it provides a very logical way of linking monitoring and reporting with prioritization and planning of actions. So the last thing I wanted to say, just to set the scene, is that for this kind of framework to work well, we ideally need indicators which have certain properties. And the first of these, if it's not obvious already, is that we really need indicators that measure as effectively as possible the outcomes achieved or expected, rather than the amounts of action implemented. So when I say outcomes, I mean outcomes for the things we actually value, things like persistence of species, for example, rather than simply measuring and reporting on the amount of action in terms of, for example, the area of land restored. And as I've already touched on, if these indicators are designed well, then they should be able to be used for both monitoring progress as well as planning and prioritising further actions. And then the last requirement that I've got there is one that I really feel is quite important but often overlooked. And this really flows from that second requirement, the need to be able to inform both monitoring and planning and prioritisation. And so this is the idea that that we should try to integrate across multiple factors, determining the outcome we actually value. So just by way of example there, if what we really value in that ecosystem and what we want to improve as a result of restoration is the expected persistence of all the species that depend on that ecosystem, then things like ecosystem extent, condition and integrity and connectivity are really, means to the end of achieving what it is we actually value in that system. And so in reality, those three things, and I'm just using this as an example, but those three attributes of the system or factors are actually going to combine to determine the expected persistence of species diversity. So if we have indicators that report those things separately and we never bring them together in some way, then we're really not able to properly measure and report progress in relation to what we're really interested in, which is improving the likely persistence of species. And then even more importantly, when it comes to prioritizing actions, if we've got those three components measured separately, then we've got to make decisions about, well, how much do we weigh? How do we balance improving ecosystem extent versus condition and integrity of existing areas of the ecosystem versus connectivity and so on? Whereas if we can instead try to work with what I would call integrative indicators that actually bring those three things together based on best available understanding of the system and best available science, then we can actually use those indicators to make decisions about which actions are going to best move us towards the outcome that we want in this case in terms of persistence of species. So Kristen, that was all I was going to say, just as a bit of a scene setter, but happy to discuss any of that further.
Thanks so much, Simon. And we do have a bit of a framework for our conversation, and those slides have been really useful for me. So I have copied these into the notes for those breakout group facilitators, just to ensure that we've got that thinking moving forward. I think what we'll do, we will be breaking into groups shortly, and I think that would be a great opportunity to, within your group, have a bit of a conversation about this approach that Simon's suggesting and really focusing in on this challenge for us today, which is to think about our goals and the indicators and how we might move. What is it that we need to be focusing on to move us toward our goals? And Simon, you use that persistence of species as your example, but it might be that your group has other goals that you wish to focus on as well. So, and I guess the real challenge here is for us to be thinking about this: how do we integrate our indicators rather than having separate indicators? So hold that thought. I'm going to lead us through, and thank you, Simon, for that thinking and helping us to. There are multiple ways we could approach this. And so the invitation for us today is to let's go with Simon's thinking here and really focus on, before we jump to targets, let's think about our goals and let's think about our indicators. But before we do jump into that breakout group exercise, and I just did see a hand go up there. Gary, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. It seems from what you've described, Simon, that when it comes to the target, there's still a huge amount of conversation needing to be had about defining the terminology, what is the intent that sits behind the target as it's currently worded. Is there any conversation going on that you're cognizant of within the national, within the Department of Environment nationally, about how they view the definition of some of those concepts? I'm just thinking that we want to be careful not to run at odds with where the policy makers and the decision makers might actually go in reality.
Yeah, good question, Gary. I am vaguely aware that those discussions are happening, but I'm definitely not in a position to speak on behalf of the federal department. You'd have to ask them. I don't know if anyone's on the call from DQ.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
Hi, Gary. I'm Madeline. Hello. I am on the line from DQ. Just to let you know that I am the person having the discussions and the conversations. My role at the moment is writing and drafting the targets and indicators for Target 2. So yes, the conversation is being had.
I want to be in whichever breakout group you're in then, Madeline. I have the arguments